Tonight, the final lesson in our study of the Intertestament times, as we went from a study of Israel having kings to the time of them having no kings. We saw the things that led directly to the Babylonian captivity, the restoration period, the end of prophets who recorded words and messages. And really there's no tradition among the Jews either in this time that God was speaking directly to prophets or working any miracles. And we have a lot of Jewish records and teachings through this period of time, so we're pretty confident that God was not speaking new revelation during this period. As we said repeatedly through the course of the class, especially at the beginning of the Intertestament period, right after Malachi, we said that God was silent during the time, not about the time. And so we saw a lot of things of God's doing things with the Greeks, or God saying that what he would do with the Greeks, the Persians before, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And somewhere along that time, especially when we passed from Greek dominance to Roman dominance, we went from Old Testament wrap-up to New Testament introduction. And so this intertestament period runs us right on into the time of the Gospels. And so that's where we'll be tonight as we look at these final things that are important to understand the Gospels, things that occurred just immediately prior to the coming of the Lord Jesus to the world. So this lesson, kind of a long title, the Jewish hope for an independent time again. So hoping for another hammer, another one who would lead them. Many of them were searching for one who would lead them to political freedom, cultural freedom, and more ability to be Jews in an ever non-Jewish world. So they'll also have some other adaptations that happened as people are, dealing with this Greco-Roman culture that was dominant in everywhere except Jerusalem and a few towns around it, and a few cities up in Galilee, but they would have been very much part of the Greco-Roman world. So we had these little pockets of Jews who were being able to be Jews, but we had most of the Jewish people dealing with on a daily basis a different language. Definitely the Greco-Roman world, the Greeks with the culture, the Romans with the politics and the power, and the Jews trying to find a place best they could. So as we have showed a couple of times, we'll show this for just about the last time. The time scale here, we had the Greeks come in, replacing the old world of the eastern world of the Babylonians and the Persians and the Medes, and bringing a world that we're quite familiar with because of the Greek heritage that our society has, not necessarily ethnic Greek, but certainly Greek ideas. And when we study the Greek world, we're into things that are familiar to us and common to us in school. And so that's when this culture was most lively and swept the world. And then the Maccabean revolt against that, as Jewish people were oppressed by rulers from Damascus who were Greek, particularly Antiochus IV being the worst, causing a revolt. And the Jews were very successful in that revolt and had for 100 years their own state. And they were able to rule as they wished. But as that fell apart, the Romans came in, and the local people, this local family of aristocrats from kind of a mixed heritage, the Herod family takes over with Roman power. And so we asked last week, how is it possible that at the Senate chambers in Rome, a fellow whose mother was an Arab and whose father was an Edomite was declared king of the Jews? Well, we studied that kind of twisted story and winding story of the Herod family. But the Roman Senate makes him the king of Judea, the king of the Jews, And he's not really quite Jewish. Not that he's not entirely Jewish either, but we had that story. And then we have these other folks who are hoping for something better. All right, so our key points in this lesson 26, the varied responses that people have as, again, Jewish people, and among them, and among that, when we talk about the Jewish people, we're talking about two groups of people. Really, they wouldn't be identifiable as separate people by their ethnicity because they're all Jews. But we know that what Paul said, not all of Israel is Israel, right? And so when we talk about the Jews, we're talking about these folks who have this traditional attachment, many of them to their ancestral religion, but not a real faith in God. Of course, there's a bunch of them just don't care. They're, just like today, there's folks that are Jewish, and how important is that Jewishness to them? Not all that much. So there were folks like that who were just pretty secular. There were folks who were very traditional, and then also interspersed with that, and you really didn't know which was which almost till the gospel came along and separated the folks out. There were the spiritual followers of God, right? The people who were living by faith and trying faithfully to follow the law of Moses in this period of time. And so we're going to look at these varied responses to the unsettled world, especially in and around Roman Palestine. And we'll also look at some of the various political hopes that people had, and others had religious hopes. And so what's going to make this better? Is it going to be in a religious identity? Is it going to be in a political identity? Is it going to be in an ethnic identity? Is it going to be, a geographic identity? What is it that we're looking forward to? And in some ways, of course, hopefully for us, we have this a little more settled in our mind. But as we live in a day where, there's, cultural upheavals and various currents pushing people different ways, what do we look forward to? What's our hope for the future and for the future of our families? Now, these people were facing some of those kind of existential questions at this point. And what we'll find is that all of these folks had reasons to look for, search for a new day. All of them had looked for a new day. Well, I see that I forgot to change the title of that slide. That title is left over from the last lesson. This is the, instead of saying Romans and Herods, let's just say, living in a Greco-Roman world. What do we do with that? And so we'll first note that these were unsettled times. And so we've seen the things that unsettled people, this Greek culture that came in, and we spent a lot of time with that. This Roman power that came in, and through talking about why the Romans were so jealous of their power, almost to the point of fanaticism about them being in charge, and with them putting the Herods in charge, we've seen some of that. And the Jews, we've seen how they basically formed up parties of Pharisees, and in response to that also Sadducees. The Pharisee party we looked at, the separatist party, the Puritan type party, they had lots of things to object to in that Jewish independent kingdom. That the rulers, the successful leaders of the rebellion, which was led by a family of priests, they took for themselves the high priestly role, and they took for themselves the political role, eventually taking even the title of king. And the Pharisees had a very valid point of objection that these people are not spiritual, that these people are the wrong family to be the high priest. These people are the wrong lineage to be the proper king, because who was supposed to be the king of Israel? Who was supposed to sit on a throne in Jerusalem? The son of David. And these guys were not. Right? If they're priests, they're definitely not what? Of the lineage of David. And then now they were descendants of Aaron. They were descendants of Levi and descendants of Aaron who took the throne, but they were not descendants of the last family of high priests. If we recall, there's a couple of different times in Israel where we had different families of high priests, but the house of Eli was replaced and the last one of his descendants who had the throne was in the time of David, and a man named Zadok took over. And all the high priests from the time of David until the time of the Maccabees, they were all descendants of Zadok. It's a line that nearly died out in the captivity, but didn't. There was a few who came back. And so this family of Zadok were the high priest until the Maccabees came, and the Maccabees said, you guys have corrupted yourself too much with the Greeks, you got to go. And so the Pharisees had a valid argument there. The Sadducees we studied as well. So we have this kind of secular, to use a modern phrase about it, liberal type party who has connections by family and by political power to the high priest and their families. And at one time the rulers, that was the Sadducees. We had the people who were connected to the synagogues mostly, and whose currency was in their knowledge of the law and their strict following of the law. That was the Pharisees. But then we also have, at this time, another group that comes, and that is the Zealots. And so in these unsettled times, the Zealots come. Now, when the Romans took over, the Romans ruled most of the time and through most of the Jewish areas. They ruled through either governors or they were sometimes called procurators, to use the Latin phrase for the governors. Sometimes they were legates, and there were some other titles. But about half of the land, about half the area is ruled directly by Romans. And the other half of the territory is often given to somebody in the Herod family. They keep going back to that well over and over and over. Not just but from before New Testament times to after New Testament times. So for about 160 or 70 years, there's some Herods who are in charge of some of it. And the Romans would rule through that family and various generations of it. And so the Romans, when there were problems, they would send in a Roman to be the direct administrator of the place. Now, anybody who has direct administration of a place, one of the most basic things that government does is collect taxes, because government has expenses, right? Have we seen the budgets for government? Government always has expenses. How does the government pay for that? Taxes. All right. Now, these Jewish folks, complacent, what's the right word? How compliant are they? And how receptive are they to direct Roman rule and direct Roman taxation? Not usually very so much. And so there's this constant fight about taxation, which, of course, is one of the things that we see through the kind of sideways version of it, through the Gospels, is when you want to describe somebody as just being of no repute, of no morals, being totally classless, being somebody not worthy of consideration for, even courteous conduct, how would you describe them? What groups of people are beyond the pale for even normal social discourse in our Gospels? Here's a couple of people, a couple of types of people that, the ones that are really, the ones that everybody dislikes, everybody looks down on. There's the tax collectors. And they're right, the tax collectors are kind of right there with the prostitutes, right? The prostitutes and the tax collectors. And probably in Jewish society, they were probably, they'd sit around at night and they would discuss in their families who has sold themselves worse. Who has more sold themselves out, the prostitute or the tax collector? Well, the tax collectors are just hated because they work with the Roman rulers. And one of the things that happens is Rome has to keep changing rulers to try and find one that can administer the place. And anybody who does administer the place very good for very long gets shipped out to someplace much more important. But mostly, it just chews up the people they send to lead, and they bring out some more. So the Jews who oppose this the most, and the Jews who said, well, you know what we ought to do, is we ought to just get rid of these Romans, like our great-grandfathers got rid of the Greeks. And when we study this from New Testament perspective, how do we know that this fight against the Romans end up? What is the ultimate result of the Jews trying to get rid of the Romans and not listen to their authority? Jerusalem is destroyed. And is it destroyed a little bit? Right, what did we just study in our Thursday night class? What did Jesus say would happen when the Romans finally came? Not one what? Not one stone is going to be left on another. And when we see the result of this with our 2020 hindsight, what do we think about the idea that that the Jews are going to be able to cast off the Romans and the Roman Empire and carve out an independent kingdom within the boundaries of the Roman Empire during what we know as the Pax Romana, the height of Roman power? What do we know about it? It's not going to work. We know that from the start, right? Because almost before we ever start to look at the topic, we already know 70 AD, right? And you think about an event where you just named the year that it happened. How many times can we just communicate this entire important sea change of political fortune or geographic fortune by saying just the year that it happened? I can only think of a few, right? 1776. Right? For Americans, that's kind of a big year. For the English, how about 1066? Norman the Conqueror. All right. How many other years can you just say a year and you know about these great things that happened? If you're old enough, how about 1945? Now, what we'd have to explain that to some people, wouldn't we? Because it's not quite even the same level, even that. So, when we say AD 70, what do we mean? The absolute, total destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And it wasn't just the buildings that went. What went in AD 70? All right, so there's an awful lot of killing and there's an awful lot of deportation. After AD 70, there is no Jewish presence in Jerusalem or anywhere within, a couple of days hike of there. So there's depopulation. That's how bad this was. Well, somebody else said a couple things. A million Jews are dead. And that's a big number in any year, but especially in the ancient world. So 1 million deaths, a total depopulation of the land. Ben? There's no genealogy tables. There are no genealogy tables for anybody after this. I mean, it is an absolute cultural and ethnic tragedy. You think about how important is the genealogy of a Jew in the Bible. How many times does the divine record pause and just give us genealogies? In the Old Testament, what do you learn about any Old Testament? Anybody who's really important in the Old Testament, what's one of the first things you find out? What tribe they're from, who their daddy was, or who their granddaddy was, or who their great-granddaddy was. Over and over. In the book of Ezra, there's when they come back from captivity, Ezra, I think it's 261. I heard this in a sermon the other day, otherwise I would never have remembered the passage. But in Ezra, there's some priests who come back, and they can't find their name in the roll books. And it's, Bible commentators are at a total loss as to, were these guys born in captivity and nobody bothered to keep the records right, or did they lose the records in the deportation, or were these guys trying to get into the priesthood because of the confusion? But they couldn't prove that this couple of fellows were priests, and they were excluded. They never got to be priests. And we don't know if they should have been or not, but they couldn't prove it, so they're out. And even in the book of Hebrews, there's arguments based on priesthood of Jesus being after Melchizedek and a greater priesthood, based on the fact that the law of Moses doesn't talk about lineage of Jesus. You know, they had this system where Jesus, because of his lineage, he could be the king, but by the rules of Israel, Jesus couldn't be a priest, could he? Because his genealogy didn't match up with that job. So the genealogies are lost. And that is a massive thing. Can any Jew today prove their descent from Abraham? None. There's a couple of families, one from Libya and one, I can't remember the exact details. There's a family of Jewish folks from what is now Libya who very likely, and when I say likely, I mean almost to the point of certainty, are real descendants of Jewish priests. But they can't absolutely prove it. These people can prove they're descended from some people who said they were Jews in the 3rd century, but they can't tie that back beyond, because why? The tables are lost. But just imagine, in the Jewish community prior to this, in the Jewish community prior to AD 70, everybody who was a Jew could prove their genealogy all the way back to Abraham. And if you know your genealogy back to Abraham, what else do you know? You know it all the way back to Adam and to God. Can you imagine living in a... Now, we just have to take it on faith we're all descended from Adam, right? Because Adam was the only life-giving spirit. And so if you have life, we can pretty well deduce you came from Adam. And then we can also, if we believe the Bible story, can we pretty well deduce we all came, at least one side of the family, from Mr. and Mrs. Noah. Yes, we all have a common ancestor, if we believe the scriptures, in Noah, at least on one side of the family. But the Jews could prove all of that. They lost that. As well as that, they lost their temple and the sacrifices. Now, there were times when the Jews lost the sacrifices. Antiochus IV stopped them for about 3.5 years, but the temple still stood. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple and stopped the sacrifices for 70 years. So just the stopping of the sacrifices, I mean, that's a tragedy. But it's not, you could always rebuild another temple, right? And so there's 2 temples. But after AD 70, do they ever rebuild another temple? No. And what's the likelihood of them getting to? Not if they want to put it back in the same spot where it was, because why? There's a big mosque sitting right on top of it. Third most important one in Islam. So, AD 70 is just this absolute tragedy. We think and wonder, as they start doing the things that lead to rebellion, getting back to where we started from, we have to ask ourselves, why did they think they could ever get away with this? Because when you see somebody do something, you know, there's a guy who, I don't know, when we were kids, we used to try and ramp our bikes off of stuff, right? And just imagine if you saw a kid ramp his bike off of something, fall down like Evel Knievel, and end up like Evel Knievel in a full body cast, and it just went completely terribly, and they're totally broken up completely, and they're in the hospital. And we would all ask the question, why did they think they could do that? And we see this Jewish disaster, and we go, why did they think they could do that? Well, why did they think they'd get away with it? Why did they think it might be successful? God might give them the deliverance again. God had, and if you read the book of the Maccabees, it's very clear the Jewish perspective is that God gave the Jews the deliverance from the Greeks, just as God throughout the Old Testament had delivered the Jews from Assyrians and the Babylonians, off and on, but, at least they got a restoration. But God had delivered them from enemies over and over and over, and the Jews had taken this Maccabean revolt to be the exact same kind of deliverance by the act of God. And so the Zealots said, let's do what? Let's do that again. Let's do that again. And Josephus tells us directly about the Zealots. He said that they got started after an incident mentioned in the Bible, that there was a census of Quirinius, and why were they counting up all the people? So they could tax them, and so they did. They counted them, and they taxed them. And a man named Judas, who lived in Galilee, he's known as Judas of Galilee or Judas of Gamala, which is the town in Galilee. He said the Romans had no right to rule. The people themselves should rule and be accountable to God alone. So we will rule ourselves, and we will be responsible, and we will all just follow God, and that'll be all the government we need. Now, imagine the Roman perspective on that. Right. There's been a few times where people say, we're all responsible before God. We don't need a government. We'll just live each family before God, and that'll be fine. Can you think of a few places where people tried that? Book of Judges. Book of Judges is a biblical example. Have there not also been in secular history afterwards a few Christian groups who said basically things like that? Probably the largest experiment in that I know of is the town of Munster right after, during the lifetime of Luther, right after the Protestant Reformation. They said, we don't need a pope, we don't need a king. And, hey, Matt, what happened in Munster? No, especially after when they reinstituted polygamy and all kinds of other things after an Old Testament model. And eventually the surrounding kings just get together and slaughter them all, just mercilessly. And then when you find out what they were doing in Munster, you go, well, maybe they had to. So that's the Zealots' vision. It's throw off the Romans like the Maccabees had thrown off the Greeks. And basically what they're waiting for is they're waiting for somebody, for a situation to get bad enough, that somebody like, what was the guy's name? Matthias? Judas's father. They're waiting for the old priest, Matthias, or it was a Mattathias. It's either Matthias or a version of the name Mattathias. They're waiting for the old priest Matthias to kill somebody and say, those with God, follow me, and lead the rebellion. They're just waiting for somebody to do that. Of course, for a little while, who did the Zealots have as a candidate to possibly do that? Who do they think would be a good leader for this movement? They thought Jesus would be a good leader for this movement. Would Jesus have been a good leader for the Zealots? Cut logistics down. An army travels on its stomach. What if you just divide out food every day for the troops? If he can walk on water, hey, they're hiding behind the lake. They're camped on the other side of the lake, or they've taken refuge behind a river. What obstacle would that be? And so, they intend in the book of John to make Jesus a king by force. And so Jesus came preaching the kingdom. Some of them are ready for the kingdom, but what kingdom has he got? A kingdom of peace that's within your hearts. The kingdom that's within you, what do they want? A kingdom with some secure walls around a good chunk of Palestine. And so the Zealots, and we know that one of the apostles, Simon, because in all the lists, what's he almost always called? Simon the Zealot. So at least one of the apostles had come from this group of people. The Zealots in later time, when we get to the actual rebellion, they really cause lots of problems. They end up fighting with each other and all the other groups of Jews. Jerusalem, when the 70 AD came, the Jews had seen that coming. They knew it was coming. And if we remember, the Romans surrounded the city temporarily and then withdrew for almost a year. And they were camped not far from Jerusalem until who was leading Rome got sorted out. Because Vespasian had brought the legions, 3 legions. He brought 3 legions to Palestine. He conquered nearly all of it. He surrounded Jerusalem. And then Vespasian got called back to Rome. Vespasian becomes the Roman emperor. And while that's getting sorted out, he leaves his son in charge, as you do. Son, lead the army. No civil service in the Romans. Nepotism was a big thing. But Titus is very capable. And so Titus is the one who takes Jerusalem. But he was camped for nearly a year outside Jerusalem. Well, the Jews who had any sense knew what? This might end badly. And so the Jews in that period of time, the Christians all left town, but the Jews who were staying packed in enormous amounts of supplies. Because what happens to food prices as soon as the siege goes up? Well, food prices go through the roof because we all need to eat. The Jews had packed in tremendous amounts of supplies and probably could have held out a siege for many years. But they started fighting amongst each other, and several of the warehouses full of food they had went up in flames, and it was mostly zealots fighting zealots or zealots fighting other groups of people. And so the suffering inside the siege wall, inside Jerusalem, is still famous for its just being absolutely terrible, and a lot of that was exacerbated by the zealots. All right, so, just mentioned a couple of times where Jesus brought this idea up. He said, those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. And another place Jesus said, that was in Matthew 26, and in Luke 21, and they will fall by the edge of the sword. They will be led captive into all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And so the zealots were fighting against what God had planned. And does it matter how dedicated you are if you're fighting against God? It just doesn't. And the more dedicated you are in a fight that goes against the will of God, just the more you're going to grind yourself up or grind others up in it. And so the zealots are an important piece of our New Testament background, and they're there because they really thought they could get rid of the Romans. And we think, well, how did they think that? Well, you can think that for 2 reasons. One, the Maccabees had gotten rid of the Greeks, and what if God is on your side? And so they had a recent historical example, and they had the firm conviction that God was on their side. All right, so that's our friends the Zealots. Now again, I think about in some of these things, how many of us, if we were living in ancient Palestine before Christ came, how many of us would have thought that's the way to do this? And even if it's really hard in hindsight because we know how badly it ends, right? But if we just take the information known up, at some place before 70 AD, how many of us would think this might legitimately be a way to do this? And don't we know? It's hard. It may be hard for us to picture ourselves doing that, but let's just remove ourselves a half step from it. Do we have friends who would have took up that cause? I mean, I got friends that are ready to throw down against the government right now, right? Don't you? How well do you think it's going to go for them? And I think most of us realize it's not going to go well. We're nowhere near a time like that. But we got people. We know people at least who talk that way. These are people who talk that way and thought that way. All right, questions on them? Our friends the Zealots. Well, that's one response. We're going to fight the power that be. I forget which rapper I just quoted there. It's not the will of God. God says submit to the powers. All right, our next response was the opposite. The complete opposite end of the political spectrum and the cultural spectrum from the Zealots. Well, what if we adapt to this world by just being as devoted as possible to the guys with power? And especially in this ancient world where so much of it is personality driven. This party is the Herodians. Kind of an English equivalent to this would be the Tories, right? The Tories go with the crown. If the crown wants it, what are we going to be? all for what the crown wants. Why would you always want to support the crown? Prestige, power, money, right? Who gives land and titles? Who let you dip into that public tax money? And so the Herodians are the group that join up with the Herods, because the Herods are in charge. And so, as we mentioned, Herod, in his lineage, he was married into some of the remainder of the Jewish royal families from the time they had their own kingdom. Herod is intermarried also, and Herod's first wife, the Jewish woman Miriam, her grandfather had been the high priest. So Herod's granddaddy-in-law had been the high priest. And so, these were not inconsequential people. And so it's people of that group. It's sort of like a super group of Sadducees, right? It's like the most connected Sadducees. They're the Herodians. And there are not that many of them. There's just not that many of them. But if you have money and power, you don't need that many to be of a huge outsized influence. It's sort of like in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, for those of us of a certain age, you can remember that evil empire. How many of the people who lived in the Soviet Union were members of the Communist Party? Anybody have any idea? Half the people, 3/4? Donnie, you think it was bigger? You're shaking your head. More or less?
They might have been on paper, but they had no real.
Right. So the Communist Party members, not the people that had to go to like Communist Party youth camps and things like that, but I mean like the real Communist Party members were never more than 6%. When they took over Russia, they were about 3% of the population. The communists were 3%. Now, I doubt the Herodians were even that much, but they are connected to the people with the power and the money. And so they make a couple of appearances in the Gospels. Early on, they plotted with the Pharisees to destroy Jesus. And again, at the end of the Gospels, they're the ones who ask the question, which is, do we pay our tax or not? And Jesus says, give to God what's God and give to Caesar what's Caesar's. It's the Herodians who came to ask that question. The two times we do see them directly mentioned by name, it's interesting that they're cooperating with the Pharisees, who in every other way were their natural enemies within the Jewish camp. There is a warning. This is in Mark 8. Jesus gave the warning that said, beware, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And so it seems he's talking there about the Herodians, probably not just Herod personally. It's interesting to note that, again, in hindsight, we would name our children Herod just about as readily as patriotic Americans would name their children Benedict, right? How many American Benedicts have you ever known? Why did the name Benedict completely fall out? Well, Benedict Arnold. Well, why does the name Herod? People name their children after Bible characters all the time, right? When I was growing up, there was a lady in our town whose name was Vashti. Not sure if her parents read that story and liked it, or they just knew it was in there. Oprah was originally supposed to be named after Orpah, the sister-in-law to Ruth, but her parents misspelled it, probably thankfully for her. But, who's named Herod? You know any Herods? Never met one. Maybe there is some. There is a Harrods department store in London, but it's different spelling, different name. Anyway, but there is in the book of Romans, there is a relative of Paul whose name was Herodian. And how Jewish was Paul's family? But one of his kinsmen, we don't know what relation, but Paul had a relative named Herodian. And so this kind of pursuit or power or closeness to power probably, as appalling to us as anything with Herod is, It wouldn't have been so when they actually had power back then. We also do note as well one other mention of Herod. There's a faithful woman, one of the women who's devoted to Jesus and helped support him, a woman named Joanna, and her husband, Hachuzah, was Herod's steward. So there were good and decent people around the Herods. They weren't all sellouts. Anyway, I just find it really interesting the Apostle Paul had a relative name for these folks. All right, so these are a couple of the responses to this highly unsettled time. Some are Zealots, some are Herodians. Next week, as we continue, we'll talk about the scribes. Then we'll also talk about the Essenes. And we'll talk about how all of this is the fullness of time, as Paul declares in the book of Galatians. And then that'll be our study.